thank you all for joining us. Tonight's lecture is part of the World of Art series of public lectures that accompany the program of our School for Curatorial Practices and Critical Writing here at SCCA Ljubljana. So just a quick note, the lecture is being recorded and will be posted online. So if you prefer, you can keep your cameras off, but I will still invite you to maybe ask a question or two at the end. Many thanks to Anca Mihuleţ for accepting the invitation for tonight's lecture, and to Vladimir Vidmar, who will now introduce our guest lecturer. So thank you.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Anca Verona, for being here with us today. Well, I met Anca Verona, I think it must be 10 years ago, when you were one of the editors of Arta magazine. I don't know if you remember, but I think any one of us who has ever spoken to Anca Verona about art was always impressed by her sharpness of mind and her erudite knowledge of most things concerning art. So I have very high expectations of tonight's lecture. So just to introduce Anca Verona to those who don't know her, she's a Romanian art historian and independent curator, and she's actually based in Seoul currently, and she has been interested in questioning and theorizing various curatorial contexts, and she has also curated some of very prominent exhibitions. She was one of the program leaders of the Contemporary Art Gallery at the Brueggenthal National Art Museum in Sibiu in Romania. After that, she was one of the curators of one of the two Romanian pavilions of the fifth biennial of Venice. After which she also received the Igor Zabel grant, well-deserved, in 2016. And after that worked as one of the curators, one of the curatorial team at the Singapore Biennial in 2019. In 2021, she curated the exhibition Chronicles of the Future Superheroes at Kunsthalle Bega in Timișoara in Romania. And this year she curated Andreea Curucic's research project, You Betrayed the Party Just When You Should Have Helped It, at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Rijeka, which is also my hometown, but I somehow managed to miss it. So I'm sorry about that. But all the more reason to look forward to Anca's lecture this evening. So Anca, do the honors.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and hello to everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I mean, it's always a nice opportunity to have the chance to share thoughts on the curatorial, because in a way our field is maybe not that broad, and I always enjoy to ignite discussions, as Vladimir mentioned, because in our exchanges we really spoke very interesting things about art and about curating, about art writing. And for tonight, as I said, like before, informally, we were talking about tonight. Of course, I wouldn't talk about myself, because I really enjoy to meditate in a way on my colleagues or my collaborator practices. I enjoy talking to them. I enjoy taking notes. I enjoy understanding their curatorial mind. So today, it's also a pleasure and an honor for me to talk about 4 of my collaborators and people I really admire in their practice. And what I'm trying to do by talking about them, I try to choose certain curatorial typologies that I found interesting, and they all stem also for my interest in art history, because I was formed as an art historian and I worked for 7 years in a museum, and this also made me in a way a good listener, really also like maybe a good learner, trying to understand what was happening on the other side, and how art historians and curators think, how do they build their exhibitions, how do they understand the spaces of the exhibition, how do they relate to the audience. And like tonight's presentation actually stems from my interviews with the 4 figures that I will present. and also from primary texts that I collected in the process of research in the past months when I was preparing my presentation. At first, I had maybe higher expectations. I also wanted to present the work of another person I really admire and with whom I collaborated back in 2019, and that was Jorge Fernandez Torres. He's the director of the Museum of Bellas Artes de La Habana in Cuba. And he was also the artistic director of two Cuban biennials, the 11th edition and the 12th edition. But unfortunately, I was not able to talk to him in the given time because Cuba was really hit by the strong typhoons in the past months, and the connection to the internet was really low. So we couldn't exchange ideas or images, which were essential for tonight's presentation. So as I was mentioning, for tonight's lecture, I'm trying to analyze this like four curatorial directions that I consider relevant for what I consider a responsible, poignant, and socially-oriented form of curating. And my presentation was built on the discussion and interviews with the following curators, and that are Patrick Flores, he's a professor of the University of the Philippines and a curator at the Vargas Museum in Manila. Hyunjin Kim, she is a former Cadiz lead curator for Asia and the curator of the Korean Pavilion in 2019 in the Venice Biennale. Beral Madra, she's one of the leading Turkish curators and the founder of the Istanbul Biennale. And Chao Wei-zhu, he is the Taiwanese new media artist that in 2019 curated the Asian Art Biennale in Taichung in Taiwan, together with the Singaporean artist Ho Tsun-yen. And again, what I'm exploring today, or maybe what I'm questioning, is how the post-colonial context is shaping the curatorial practice, and how through the curatorial research and the collaboration we can rethink margins, whether they are geographical, theoretical, or ideological. And also another aspect that happened while I was talking to my colleagues, I addressed a lot the issue of time, because I was interested in the curatorial time. And I wanted to understand how my fellow curators were approaching the notions of historical and contemporary time. How would they mingle? How would they make a balance between them? Because even though we are trying to sometimes leave the historical behind and we are trying to be ultra contemporary, it somehow always comes back to us. So we need to address it in a way, or even kill it. Like sometimes you have to do it in order to advance. So just to give a heads up, my presentation is rather dialectical. I'm trying to follow all these parallel curatorial narratives, and at the end, maybe together we can reach some conclusions. I didn't want to be patronizing in any way and reach some conclusions ahead, but if there is an interest at the end and we can talk, I would be very happy to discuss this aspect with you. And I try to construct my four directions of the presentation in a way that they are overlapping each other, trying to see like artists that were introduced by a curator and then they return to another curator's practice, although they were in a way parallel. So it was interesting to me to follow this. And first, I would go back with you in a year that was maybe very important for the order of things. It was 2008. It was a year like influenced by this major economic crisis that definitely shaped our perspective back then. And in that year, Okuyan Wezor became the artistic director of the Gwangju Biennale in South Korea. And that edition was co-curated by Hyunjin Kim and Ranjit Hoskote. And the title was intriguing, Annual Report, A Year in Exhibitions. So in a way, right, it was a very stiff title and it made anybody curious. But what happened with this project was actually opening the rhizomatic way of looking at art, and not having a unidirectional form of exhibit, but rather trying to create a long, like a durational way of working with artists and creating various contexts, maybe even creating zones of comfort and discomfort in order to test the limit of art in, let's say, a moment when there was a hot topic surrounding us. And the Biennale itself was a report on the distribution system of artistic and cultural forms, and the reflection on the intermediary gap between artist, producer, practitioners, and audience, as the official statement read. And for the Biennale, they were invited 127 artists from 36 countries. And it was developed around three components. So I like this trinity in a way. It's really interesting because on one side there was the subject matter called On the Road, which were a series of exhibitions that took place from 2007 to 2008. So they were like more preparatory for what would come. Then there was this cluster called Position Papers, which is a series of curatorial proposals and experiments by curators working in Southeast Asia, North Africa, South Korea, and the United States, but still they were working on the margins. And the final one, the final component, were called Insertions. And it was a series of new and independent projects that represented the core of the Biennale. Let's say it was more like the traditional part. And the exhibition in itself was innovative. As I mentioned, it didn't present a linear format, but it was rather the rhizomatic one, aiming towards a statement of collective authorship. And for Envasor, for talking to other curators that collaborated with him, he really positioned the curator in the center. And he would get involved in the display of the works and try to understand the background of each artist in order to present her projects in a responsible manner. And some say he was a formalist. So indeed, form was very important in order to make the poignant presentation. And I will just stop a bit on this cluster, which I found interesting, called the Position Papers. And for this one, 5 curators were selected: Patrick Flores, Abdella Karum, Jang-Gun Kim, Sung-Yen Park, and Claire Tancons. And the only rule for this direction was that they had to present no more than 5 artists that were working at the border between media. They had to make a position, and each of the projects was to be seen as a work in progress, a provisional essay towards a larger horizon, as mentioned by the Biennale team. So each curatorial method was different. I wouldn't stop at each of them. Maybe I will just mention, and here I will share my screen a bit. I will just mention the project of Claire Tancons, was called Spring. And for her project, she organized a carnival that problematized the idea of protest and public gathering. Yes, and this carnival was actually a hybrid event that she called part carnival parade, part demonstration, and part funeral procession. And it took 90 minutes, and the people were all moving on the streets of the city. And as I heard from the ones that assisted, it was breathtaking. And it consisted of a procession featuring works of artists from Brazil, Haiti, Trinidad, Tobago, USA, France, Germany, Hong Kong, and South Korea. And the attempt was to revive the emancipatory energies of the 1980s Korean Spring, as described by Tancons, because in the 1980s, there were the famous student protests on the same streets. So it was, in a way, a tribute and also a celebration for that event. Other curators, for instance, Jang-Gun Kim.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, could you show the photos? Could you show the photos?
Don't you see it?
No.
It's not visible? I see. Let me check why. Let me, yes, maybe the share screen was off. Yes, good that you told me. Sorry for this. Yes, I will just share the screen now. Just a second. Wait a bit. Yes. Now it's visible, right?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
So this was the procession. Sorry for this. I didn't realize it. I was carried away.
No problem.
So these were images from the procession. Now it was a big. And what happened at Claire, she worked with the local people, with communities, and for a month they prepared all this. So in a way, it really came from the heart, and it really communicated to the history of the place. And I wanted to now pass to Patrick Flores, because with him I talked a lot about the position papers. And he presented here a project that was named Turns in Tropics. artist-curator. And I like this binary of artist-curator, because he really presented 4 artist-curators from Southeast Asia, which was quite unique in a moment when Southeast Asian art was not that well known. And it was not only the presentation of their works, but also he introduced texts that they wrote and images from exhibitions that they curated. And the artists were Reja Piadasa from Malaysia, and you can see here his work. And Raimundo Albano from the Philippines. He actually had a central position in the presentation. And this work that you see here, entitled Stepped on the Sand and Make Footprints, was presented first in 1974 in Tokyo, in an exhibition where it also received the grand prize. It was a printing exhibition. And for Raimundo Albano, this sand box, really simple with the sand in which people stepped, was a way of printing. And the jury in Tokyo rendered him the great grand prize because they considered the footprint as a way of printing. And it was very nice because people would touch the sand and they will just carry it everywhere. So it was interesting to see this idea of the trace and how it physically remains. And why for Patrick Flores, Raimundo Albano was very important, because he was not just a representation of identity, but it was a mode or a source of thinking, or let's say a theoretical source for the entire demonstration. And Albano's work was totally, as I mentioned, instructional, and it was the central part of the exhibition. But his demonstration was more connected to an epistemological system, because this work and his presence could only be produced, let's say, firstly in the Philippines and then taken to another context. And the Philippines for the curator was a specific context. And by taking it to another context, it offered a different way to write a narrative that didn't respond to the dominant reality of that moment. And with this exhibition, Flores was looking into how form was produced, because for him, form was an entry point in the exploration of identity in a time when the identity politics was very strong in 2008, and it was usually well punctuated in the dominant artistic discourse. On the other side, for Flores, form and the production of form represented an allegory. And that was in the sense of awareness towards the third world. And he really wanted to question this paradigm in his project, like bringing the Southeastern Asian artists, consider the third world, and creating this discourse around them. And why it was important to do this in Gwangju. As I mentioned, Gwangju is an iconic city for the development of democracy in Korea. And Flores used Raimundo Albano not only as a source for art and conceptualism outside Europe or the Americas, but as a theoretical source and a model for the different type of practice, the so-called, let's say, conceptualism of the form. And what is important for this particular project was the suggestion of a mood and an alternative way of looking at art. And also, it's interesting to see the curatorial ability to use this epistemic layering, because Patrick Flores was creating a discourse between artists as curator and curators as artists, because Raimundo Albano was not only an artist, but he was also curating and organizing exhibitions from the 60s onwards in the Philippines. And he didn't want to only discuss identity, but he wanted to find a way of representation outside the identity politics. And I quote Flores here. He was saying, "I was trying to discover a way of thinking, not only a place where a talent can be outsourced." And apart from Raimundo Albano, Patrick Flores also showed Apinan Posyananda. He was a filmmaker from Thailand. And also Jim Subamkat with his work Kendenes from 1975 and remade in 1996. He's from Indonesia. So these were a few slides from the exhibition. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of documentation from that moment, so it's a bit scarce, but still interesting how the space looked. And Patrick was also mentioning to me that he had an interesting neighbor, Martha Clark, and his widow was there to arrange the works. And for him, it was very interesting, this porosity between him as an American artist that changed a lot for the art history, and the Southeast Asian artists. And this porosity and this contamination in the space, he took it as a serendipitous happening that sometimes, you know, in an exhibition space, when you don't expect, you have very interesting connections that can generate, you know, further information and further senses around the curation. And after this project in 2015, after a 51-year absence in the Venice Biennale, Patrick Flores curated the pavilion, the Filipino pavilion there, and it was a big event for the Philippines, because you can imagine, after 51 years, they had a presence. They had a presence there, and this, in a way, was a heavy choice and a heavy chore for Patrick Flores, because he realized that he has to question time, and he also has to question the moment, you know, like to create this intermingling between historical time and the moment. And what was happening in the moment in regard to the Philippines in that year, 2015, there was a hot topic in that particular time. There was a geopolitical dispute over the South China Sea. And from this geopolitical dispute, things went further, and it became a really big territorial dispute in the area between China and the Philippines that reached the court in Hague. And Patrick wanted to address the issue, but in a way, he also wanted to mediate the tension of the, let's say, the news. And he was looking again for a different temporality in which to situate the exhibition. And I mentioned the tension and why was it there, the tension, and actually it resided from two sides. On one side, as I mentioned, there was this long absence of the Philippines in Venice, and on the other side, and the question was how to move away from the news cycle, from the territorial dispute, and how to offer a different layer of interpretation and give another duration to the topic. So the curatorial strategy was to go back in time and to present a historiography of conquest, not just because this was the news of the day, but because it was also about conquest in general, and how does conquest affect us, also from this post-colonial perspective. And he went back to the 1950s, because in the 1950s also the regimen of Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia was changing. Not only to mention that the Korean War created a totally different configuration of the peninsula. And he thought about a film that was produced in the 50s in the Philippines. It was a film about Genghis Khan. As I mentioned, it was, and later in 1952, it was presented at the Venice Film Festival. So therefore, from a methodological point of view, the Filipino pavilion had to break the binary between the local and the global, and had to restitute an expanded identity. And again, a dialogue was ignited there. The film was not at all local. It was global. It was produced locally, but actually traveled everywhere in the epoch. It circulated so both locally and both globally, and it was used back in the 1950s to talk about the history of the modern, because Genghis Khan was the one that set the basis for the modern system. And the line from the film, it was a line at the end of the film that was used as a title for the exhibition, "Tie a String Around the World." And the pavilion consisted in the presentation of Conde's film. So it was created like a room, a special room where they presented Genghis Khan. And also together with the film, there were drawings of Carlos Francisco. Carlos Francisco collaborated with Manuel Conde to create the work, and he was the one that made the costumes, the set design. So it was very interesting after all these years to restitute to Venice this film as part of an identitary politics. So these are some scenes of the film, and these are the drawings. And here you can recognize this shape that was above the head of Genghis Khan when he was looking on the Mongolian, towards the Mongolian territory. That was interesting. Patrick told me that the pavilion was in Palazzo Mora, and many people were confused because at the first floor there was the Mongolian pavilion, and on the second floor the Philippines were presenting the film about Genghis Khan. So it was again this porosity in between the two discourses that was beneficial in the grand scheme of things. And apart from the film of Genghis Khan and the drawings of Carlos Francisco, there were two newly produced works. One was a Dash State by Mani Montelibano. The film was shot in the disputed territories in the South China Sea, actually at the verge between the Philippines and the South China Sea. It was too risky to go exactly there, although this was the intention at the beginning. And the film also picked the radio signal from China, because the villagers in that area could only listen to the Chinese radio. And sound, although unexpectedly at first, became an important conjoint to the project. And Montelibano played with this idea, the sound and the importance of sound, and also with the epic of the place. And within this, again, another binary appeared, because the stream became the sound and the sound became the stream from a technical point of view. And it was a means to address the issue on one level of the deep localization because of the epic time, the one that was generated by the Genghis Khan film. And on another level, the issue of intense migration, that is because of the radio and the sea. And it was also parallel to the Filipino migration and the work of the Filipino sailors on the sea. This is a still from the film. And the other work that used this exhibition was Shawl, made by Jose Tense Ruiz. And the work, as you can see, consisted of this large size boat, which, as it seems, was a direct statement, in a way pathetic, but also poetic, because it looked like a destroyed subboat from a war, while the architecture of the place, actually, and as the name says, Shawl, was a reference to Sierra Madre, which is the highest mountain range in the Philippines. And the ship was made out of metal and wood and covered in velvet, in the red velvet. And it was an allegory, actually, for the Filipino troops that were outposted there in the South China Sea, in the disputed territory, in really harsh mental and physical conditions. So these are a few slides with the ship. And this is like, let's say I would finish here the two projects Flores by saying that for me, his endeavor in these two disparate projects was that Patrick Flores wanted to find a way to treat is congruent with the art historical time. And he needed to find a solution for bringing the historical to the contemporary, but mediated through the time of art history. So that was in a way the secret, the time of the art history. And this process of time artification for me was quite unique. And I think it was also generated by the fact that Flores handles curation as an accumulation of personal histories that usually overlap. And departing from this idea of time and history, I wanted to see it from another angle. And in this sense, I talked to the Korean curator Hyunjin Kim about her latest project called Frequencies of Tradition, which was showed starting from the end of last year to the beginning of this year in Incheon Art Platform. It's an alternative space in the city of Incheon, in the metropolitan area of Seoul. And why I wanted to, I wanted to talk to her about this issue, because she once told me that she explored an interest, she developed an interest in exploring the different facets of Asian modernization. And for me, like, modernization is also historical time, but paradoxically, we always talk about modernity nowadays. So in a way, for us, modernity is congruent with contemporaneity. So I wanted to explore more this idea. And she was a guest curator in Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And during her residency, by working with the collection, she understood the importance of finding modes to present modernity and to reflect on modernity from a curatorial point of view. Let's say not architectural, not from the point of view, I don't know, of music or film, but strictly curatorial. And in this way, she wanted to outline her own critical apparatus and discursive approach. And earlier I mentioned how Flores extrapolated the historical time by transgressing it to an art historical time. But for Kim, for Hyunjin Kim, the interest was in tradition. So she dismissed time and the usage of the word time, but she started to use the word and the concept of tradition. And she mentioned that the very first time when she worked with the concept of tradition was back in 2012, when together with the Korean artist Siren Eun Young-jung, she tried to find ways of expanding the feminist language and to trace the gender and queer histories of Korea through looking into the biographies of theater actors of the genre that emerged in the newly formed nation after the 1950s, after the Korean War. At first, the assumption was that the Korean Confucianist culture, dominant back then and even now in Korea, didn't have space for the queer culture. But they actually discovered the total opposite, which was an amazing surprise for a researcher, because in the transitional time from pre-modern to modern Korea, there were many examples, especially coming from the genre of theater and cinema, that showed the opposite. That there was interest actually in queer culture. There were many queer actors active from the 15 onwards. And the histories and critical study reflections reveal that traditions were entangled with the modernization period throughout Asia, not only in Korea. And this was again a discovery. And she found in this way a strategy for creating a space of empowerment, because she wouldn't just deal with the negative side of tradition, because sometimes, especially when we work with contemporary art, tradition can have this negative connotation. And this was also my question to her: why we talk indeed about this negative side of tradition? And here she explained things from a personal perspective, and she said that during her youth she was part of the underground scene. And for her, tradition was not interesting at all, not even traditional music or dance, because there was a certain fatigueness about tradition in the early 2000s. And this came because tradition was considered in a way a patriarchic realm, which was discriminatory in regard to women, in regard to age, and particularly due to the Confucianist tradition, the fact that the concept of tradition was enforced by the military governments in Korea, and it became an apparatus for nationalism, which is also a matter that is regarding us in Central and Eastern Europe. And at that time, at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, she was interested in Western music, in Western art, in Western society in general. But at some point in her group, there was a cultural turn, and the interest in tradition and in traditional music and movement and dance was activated. And she started an informal research in her friends' circle in regard to contemporary dance and movement, because many of them were dancers. And at that point, she started to think of tradition as a new language that was valid for a contemporary communication. And at first, there were many things that they didn't understand, but through the language of contemporaneity, through music, and especially through dance, as I mentioned, they realized that actually tradition was entangled in their life. It was an active presence. And here I just want to show you a few images from Siren's project in the Inchonart platform, because she has this marvelous archive of theater actors from the 50s, and also a lot of pictures and letters and screen plays. So it's quite interesting how she developed this research from 2008 up until now. But let's say I would put this moment into brackets, and I would go forward to the year 2014, when Hyunjin Kim, she was serving as the artistic director of Arco Art Center, and she invited David Te, who was assistant professor at the University of Singapore, and Jang Yong-yu, who was a composer and a director, to co-curate a seminar, a symposium, Tradition Unrealized. And this symposium was followed by the publication, it was a publication and an anthology, with the workings of the seminar. And here I just took this from the publication because it was very interesting what they were discussing, because they started to discuss about tradition from the post-colonial perspective, and to talk about Korea during the Cold War, which was a discussion not that hot at the moment, and also to talk about artistic labor in Southeast Asia, and to talk about Orientalism and post-Orientalism. So it was quite an important moment when many of these concepts were brought forward. And the anthology actually offers an in-depth understanding of the critical studies on tradition and the rethinking of the Asian modernization. And if anybody wants to consult it, it's on Academia Edu, and you can find it there and read it because it's quite interesting. And this symposium didn't present a chronological or art historic approach, but it was rather an exploratory process around this meaning of the modernization from the contemporary perspective, which was congruent with the Westernization in East Asian countries. And the three organizers considered that the project would open up contemporary approaches to tradition in search of practical and theoretical strategies for rethinking cultural inheritance and its potential critical amplitude in the present. With its complex narratives and ambivalent gestures, tradition may withhold as much as it reveals of the past. It may be a vehicle of provocation as much as of nostalgia. It may address an unknown future as much as a known past. Tradition Unrealized insisted on a more plural understanding of Asia's traditions, some of which neatly modern ways of living and thinking into contemporary ones, while others became marginal or exotic to the society that would claim them under the general disenchantment of modernity, as the curatorial statement read. Tradition Unrealized spoke about the possibility to create continuity when it comes to tradition and to rebuild the archival spaces where information is missing due to conflicts or other kind of disruptions, because this was a thing that they discovered by analyzing tradition in Asia, because due to conflicts, there were some brackets and tradition was suspended. There were empty spaces. And in this context, Kim stated that the process of evaluating traditions or through the tools of contemporaneity involves ambivalences. And it's not about one conclusion or the other. This is the way that she answers to my question in regard to the conclusions of the seminar, because I was curious when you invite people in this type of seminar and you discuss if there were any type of conclusions reached, but actually there weren't in the pure sense of a conclusion. And what happened throughout the seminar, which was really open and the discussions were so real, is that there was a new epistemological awareness in learning about tradition in Asia. And for her, tradition became a promotion. I mean, generally, tradition is a promotional tool, but she tried to understand why this happens, especially in countries that suffered a degree of Westernization after World War II. And these were the cases of both Korea and Japan. Also during the Cold War, countries like Taiwan or South Korea appealed to tradition in order to create an identity in front of China or North Korea respectively, and in a way like to reinforce who they were. And this was part of the process of modernization, Asian modernization. In the workings of the seminar, David Te reflected on the labor-intensive modes of artistic production in China, Thailand, and Korea, and on the Orientalistic way of artistic production in the West, and how it was imprinted in the collective memory, this Orientalistic aura, let's say, And because of this, there was a certain scenario in the West when it came to interpreting Asian art at that moment. Park Chang-kyung, a Korean film director and artist, he talked about the ghost of the Minjung art. Minjung art, it's a term for the art of the people, characteristic to the 1980s in Korea. And he offered a deeper understanding on the formation of images in that period, the 1980s in Korea, and how the empowering of people can be generated by visuality. And he also evaluated the degree of Orientalism and post-Orientalism in Korean modernism, and how actually the ghost of history has been revived in the process of the identity formation. And in this way, another kind of time awareness was opened. And all these discussions and all these threads that were open and sometimes closed were leading to the exhibition I mentioned at the beginning, the frequencies of tradition. Because after that moment in 2014, Kim was trying to make an exhibition that would offer entangled lines around this research. And she was interested to find artists that would reflect on the complex subject matters, not just illustrate them. She imagined that the works would talk through time-based materials, avoiding to transform the project in an archival one. And the choice of the title, Frequencies of Tradition, is quite relevant. And here is the scheme that she included in the publication of the project. I don't know if it's legible or not, but I think it is. Because here she discovered all these terminologies and geographical directions. As I mentioned, South Korea versus North Korea, China versus Taiwan. How was identity formed? The degree of nationalism that was inflicted when thinking about tradition. And again, you can see the idea of the patriarchy that informed Confucianism, and the instrumentalization of history through nationalism and the ideology during the Cold War and post-Cold War. And the Korean title of the exhibition is totally different than the English one. It reads The Theater of the Inheritance and the Transmitted Past, but it was hard to translate it into English. The English version actually signifies the various signals that stem from tradition, showing that there is not only one direction. And both titles, Korean and English, can express the fact that there are still spaces for emancipation, spaces for the empowerment of communities, spaces where information is transmitted generationally. And in the end, one can learn from tradition, especially if tradition enables these pocket spaces where other types of communities actually can be formed. And the feeling of entanglement that is actually essential for the curatorial work brings more possibility and also allows the formation of a space for thinking about queerness, which was actually the basis of a research back in 2012. And many of the works in the exhibition, they do talk about the importance of the generational transmission through collective stories. And this became another possibility to reestablish some lost communities of thought. And this map, Yeonjin Kim, she named it the knowledge map. And it can be found in the publication, the brochure that was accompanying the exhibition. And I will try to talk a bit about, I selected maybe 3 works that I considered really relevant, belonging to artists that I also worked with. And still before talking about this work, I would also reflect again, because we are talking about the curatorial, I would reflect again on Kim's practice and also the choice of media, because during our discussion, I was wondering why most of the works are actually videos, are films, documentaries, animation, and only a few works are 3-dimensional, a few works are objects or paintings. And I was curious how this choice of media was informing the display and the relation with the space. And as she mentioned, although it was a research-based exhibition, she didn't want to show any research materials or any type of archival materials that could have been a trap in her demonstration about tradition. And most of the works, they were artist-produced works. And one key aspect in how she created the display was the idea of the theater that involves rhythm and time, moving image, a sort of animation of sorts. And these were important, like essential elements in the exhibition making. And what is interesting is that this exhibition, you can't really experience it through the photos, because the space was in a way theatrical, and having a lot of video works or new media works, it was hard to document it. The only way that you can experience the exhibition afterwards was, let's say, would be through the video of filming of the exhibition. But otherwise, when talking about the exhibition, you can only show slides due to the way that the exhibition was actually constructed. And the animating elements, the moving images, together with these time-based works, and the rhythm inflicted to the exhibition and the sound, they were highly important in creating this state of mind. And because of the films that are, in a loop, there is this repetitive factor that becomes a ritual. And because of this, the viewer is allowed in a way to immerse into the topic, even if he's not able to watch all the works in the exhibition. And for the usage, let's say the extensive usage of new media for this project, Frequencies of Tradition, led to this coagulation of binaries in the exhibition space. And she did consider a lot that dualism, in a way, should be embraced, but also interrupted when talking about tradition. And that's why she favored the media-based works to the static traditional image reproduction, or to, let's say, handcraft in a way. And supporting, let's say, the concept of the exhibition, talking about tradition and about time, the Korean artist Ayon Kim presented a work from 2019 called Petragenetrix. The work is based on her trip in 2019 to Mongolia, because she went there to research the abundant animistic belief system and the orientation of the people towards the land, toward mother rocks, towards stones, to secret caves where the human guilds would be purified. And in the Mongolian, like throughout Mongolia, there is this wider life, like all the other natural elements. And she considered this, let's say, origin of the myth that exists in Mongolia, that human beings were formed from rocks. And Ayon Kim traced this topic and created her own hyperbolic mythology, which was connected to the origin of Petragenetrix by integrating interviews with a historian, a geologist, a museum director, and different locals. And by the way of the notion of petrogenesis, which refers to the genesis of rocks, Ayon Kim wondered the interrelated and overlapped layers of time, as though they were lost in the Earth's strata. Another interesting project that was presented in the exhibition, another work from 2019, entitled Stones and Elephants, created by the Taiwanese artist Zhao Weizhu, talks about another, let's say, belief. And this time the action takes place in Malaysia. The work derived from a classic novel called Hikayat Abdullah that was published in 1849. The author was Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, who served as the secretary of the Major General William Farquhar, who is the father of modern Singapore in the 19th century. And what was happening in this novel, it was actually a chronicle of Abdullah's life in Malaysia. And it was more like a journal that was published in the form of a novel in 1949. And the Juice video installation is based on 2 chapters of the book. And actually what you see in the image is like the wall of the Malacca citadel, that is, being exploded, in a way, exploding history, exploiting local beliefs. And for this video, for the work, he invited a Malayan shaman to read the 2 chapters as a voiceover, and actually to also pray for a peaceful filming process there in Malacca. And the chapter about the Malacca fort depicts how the British destroyed the strong fortress to weaken Malacca, as you can see on the wall with the wallpaper. And in this way, the control of the region returned to the Dutch East India Company, while the other chapter describes the locals and William Farquhar, his interest in ecology, in his interest in zoology. So it was, they were two like discordant in a way chapters. And the video was filmed with a drone there in Malacca, while the shaman was reading the chapters from the book and also doing this incantation for the filming, as I mentioned. And what is interesting about this piece is that some words in the elocution, they were linked to the internet. And it was almost as if you would start a search on the internet. So for instance, there was a lot about the elephant because they tried to catch an elephant. William Farquhar and the locals tried to catch it. And then the internet would provide the imagery about that. But of course, because the information and the searches on the internet, they change all the time. Every time the work was showed, there was a different rendering of the images. So in a way, more history and more contemporary history was created based on these old stories from the 19th century. And this is also part of the video with the filming of the drone. I would also talk a bit about this very interesting project of the Singaporean artist Ho Tsun Yen called Voice of Void that was presented in the exhibition. It was a new piece of moving image. It involved an installation of animation and a virtual reality component that was featuring the Kyoto School of philosophers who exercised great influence upon the ideological world in Japan during the 30s and the 40s, the 1930s and the 1940s. And the Kyoto School was formed by philosophers, principally Kitaro Nishida and Hajime Tanabe, who aspired to overcome the Western philosophy by drawing from Western concepts such as the void. And the so-called four heavenly kings of Kyoto School were Keiji Nishatani, Masaki Kosada, Iwao Koyama, and Shigetaka Suzuki. And in the film, in the animation of Ho Tsun Yen, they hold a roundtable discussion that was titled The Standpoint of World History and Japan. And this discussion really took place in November 1941, right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the work approaches the roundtable discussion and other texts that were produced by the circle around the Kyoto School during the aforementioned years by using virtual reality and animation to uncover the complex background behind them. Here you can see how they were discussing. So in a way, it was a moment of intellectual peace that was preceding this aggression from the atomic bomb attack. And here you can see what actually the VR and the fact that the space really looked like let's say the original meeting space of the Kyoto School philosophers. And let's say what I wanted to emphasize, I was now meditating until this point, is that within the post-colonial curatorial discourse, generally from also my experience and from what I'm presenting now, there is little space for speculative thinking, because most of the projects that I also explained a bit to you now are based on specific realities and on facts, and there is little space for the unexpected or for, let's say, theories or actions that are not being covered by the historical phenomenon in itself. And departing from this idea, I want to go forward and continue with another view, but this time to talk a bit about how economics and the socio-political context influences the curatorial practice. And here I would like to explain the curatorial proceedings of Beral Madra, which is one of the leading curators in Turkey. She's from the first wave of contemporary art curators in Turkey, and one of the founders of the Istanbul Biennial. And in Beral's case, I was interested about the dialectical view upon history and the dialogue between the complicated historical strata in Turkey and the contemporaneous demands generated by the economic development of Turkey from the 80s onwards. And during our interview, I asked to Beral how, everything started. How did everything start in Turkey, in Istanbul? And she meditated on the conditions in the 1980s, which she considered a very difficult period for that part of Europe, because there was no regional communication at the cultural level. And for me, it was very interesting to hear how a set of artistic events led to the formation of the first biennial in the region, because it was not a simultaneous process. It was not that the state decided that there should be a biennial in the region, but there were several cumulative events, and also this influx of private money that made this possible in a way. And Beral told me that in the 1970s, one could identify the threads of a very strong avant-garde movement in Turkey, but this was rather invisible because the artists couldn't show their so-called dissident works. And it was obvious that the abstract paintings produced in the time conveyed a discourse and contained a message, but because they were abstract, it was fine to show them because the audience wouldn't perceive that hidden message. On the other side, figurative painting was not easy to display in Turkey at the time. And the early conceptual art started in Turkey in around 1975, when a group of artists constructed an infrastructure for installations. So that's how this idea of the conceptual art was ignited. And they started to work together without a curator, because at that moment, the concept of curator was really not that well known. This was another aspect I was interested to ask to Beral, how did the history of curatorship begin? Because I was imagining that maybe this happened in the 70s by way of influence or by contamination, but it was not like that. But they were the artists that organized themselves, and then the curator started to work with the artists. And in 1980, in Turkey, there was a military intervention, and there was a period of dictatorship until 1985. And in 1985, Turkey experienced the liberalization of economy, and the private sector started to be really visible in the social life. And also in that moment, 1985, the idea of the Turkish integration to the European Union began. And Mada described that at that time, there was a lot of hope, and that was a good feeling. There was a really, let's say, good energy for the development of contemporary art. And in this way, because people were really hopeful in this European future, and also there was this liberalization of the economy, new cultural policies started to stem in Turkey. And the private sector, which was already successfully supporting music and theater, started to have a real interest in modern and contemporary art. Then a crucial year for the development of curatorship and let's say new ideas in Turkey was 1986. And in that moment, Beral, she was invited in the board of a new initiative that aims to present contemporary artworks in the frames of an exhibition during a music and theater festival. And the board, they met, and they decided to invite museum directors and curators that were already famous in Europe for the avant-garde production, and make a seminar, a workshop with them, and decide together how is best to present contemporary art in Turkey, and how is best to present Turkish contemporary art, let's say for an international audience. And important names like Germano Celant or Norman Rosenthal, they came to Istanbul. And after visiting the city and after the discussions, they suggested that it would be best to use the historical spaces in Istanbul, because this is really unique. And this is a way that artists can be attracted to Turkey. And in this way, a regional discourse can be produced. And in that year, they approached different exhibition spaces like Santa Irene, that was a really beautiful Byzantine church, and Hagia Sophia, the military museum, they were all located in the center of Istanbul, and they approached them for this event, and they all agreed to show contemporary art in their premises. And Beral Madra remembered how hard it was in that moment to reach to the artists, because there was no infrastructure, so she had to look into art magazines and catalogs, or to depend on some already formed art networks in various capitals in Europe. And she mentioned that she already had an art network that was constructed by her husband, and in this way they had very good connections in Italy, and they could invite many Italian artists, among whom there was, let's say, Michelangelo Pistoletto. And she discovered then a good network in France, and she could invite French artists, or in Germany. And that is the reason why in this first biennial there was a predominance of artists from Italy and France. And just a second. Here was the work of Arnulf Rainer, Faces, Christ's Faces, that was shown in, or Michelangelo Pistoletto, Marcus Lüpertz. And she mentioned that for that biennial, they could really attract interesting artists because, let's say, the method of work was innovative. The artists came to Istanbul, they spent time there, and they interacted with the space, producing works especially for that location. And let's say that was quite amazing for the time, because a really special energy was created in Istanbul. Although for that biennial, the term of curator was not used. For the first biennials, Beral Madra, she was the coordinator. This is how her name was introduced. And the biennial didn't have this name from the beginning, like the Istanbul Biennial. It was first named Contemporary Art in Historical Spaces, the first two editions. This was the name that was used. And while I asked her how would she evaluate the results, let's say the artistic results of that time, she said that the conclusions and the presentation of the artist was really, really good. And because it was that good, this is how they could continue to produce the second edition of the festival that would become the biennial. And the reason why they wanted to make it a biennial was that they needed this period of 2 years to gather more finances, to find more possibilities to show art. And it was there in 1987 that they first started to discuss what it means to have a biennial in the region, and to discuss the concept of the biennial based on the realities of the region, not to import, let's say, the Western formation of the term. Again, Beral Madra, she coordinated the second biennial using the same strategies. She invited again several museum directors and curators from various European countries to discuss again in the format of a seminar what would be the role of this event in Turkey. And also this time, by inviting people, she was trying to form a network that was specific to the region. And she also mentioned, because we talked about how could you invite the artists back then to be part of the exhibition, especially unknown artists, young artists, how would this happen? And she said that it was pretty hard to present unknown artists outside Turkey, because you couldn't reach out to them. Like, she had this intention to present African art, but there was no possibility to reach out there through the let's say the three main means that they had, like fax and telephone, or simply by writing letters. And it was like curating at that moment was not that much about display and the relation with the space, but it was more about the initiative, like being voluntary to do things, about, as I mentioned before, creating the network that would enable the representation of a project and let's say the degree to which you can expand the project. And also there was this ability she mentioned, which I found it quite metaphoric, the ability to be able to convince people on the phone that it's worth coming there, it's worth creating a work of art for that space. And in the second biennial, as general coordinator, she focused on microhistories. And an interesting case was that of Sol LeWitt, who mentioned that when his father left Russia, he stopped in Istanbul, and Istanbul had a really special place for him. And what was very nice for that edition of the biennial, that they could use the Suleimani Mosque, which is one of the most, let's say, magnificent mosques in Istanbul. And here Sol LeWitt could create this interesting geometry on 3 walls, which is quite unique for his practice. And in the same mosque, she could show the works of Daniel Buren and also of Yanis Kounelis. And what I wanted to mention as a conclusion of this part that I dedicated to the work of Beral Madra was that what the biennial opened was this, let's say, new vista for the cultural sector of Turkey, because the cultural agents in Turkey, they became aware of the fact that art shouldn't be local anymore, that it should be international. And being international was a must. And this happened especially in the context of the 90s, and when Turkey was passing this process of post-modernization. And even if the state policy didn't follow the reality, the private sector actually understood that it was essential to be visible on the cultural level in order to attain, let's say, more prestige, as Beral mentioned. And in that moment, after the 2 biennials, the big industry started to build collections and museums. And already I was talking to her about this idea of the private museum, that at the beginning of the 2000s, the private museums started to appear in very interesting parts of the city, and they became very active because the older museums, which were more historical, they were in a way stopped in the 1980s because they couldn't acquire more art, they couldn't reestablish their display. So they were stuck like in a suspended modernity in a way. And it was interesting in regard to this discussion because, talking to Beral Madra, I realized how important visibility was in that moment, and how important it was also for her and for other Turkish curators to bring Turkish art to the stand, to make Turkish art known, because as I understood from her, it was a very difficult process that really took a lot of time. And I asked her about the representation of Istanbul, of Turkey in the Venice Biennial, and she mentioned that everything happened serendipitously because in 1989 there was an exhibition in Bari where Mediterranean art was presented, and it was one of the first largest exhibition where Turkish art was visible. And there she was approached by the curator of the Venice Biennale, and she invited her to present Turkey. And although there was not a system in Turkey, because they didn't have a pavilion, and nothing was, let's say, ratified to present art in the Venice Biennale, the Venice Biennale team managed to send a letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Istanbul, offering them the participation of Turkey in Venice without any cost. They would even offer the space in order for them to present the Turkish art. And it was in 1991 that the first pavilion of Turkey was presented in the Venice Biennale. And that was the way that the traditional presentation of Turkey began. And because I talked to her a lot about representation, I was curious how she was constructing the discourse in regard to this visibility of the Turkish art. And she mentioned that she usually preferred to present group shows because in this way she would really create more opportunities for the artists. And what she was trying to express as a curator through the practice and through the exhibition was that there was free expression in Turkey, because that was the stereotype, that in Turkey there was no free expression. And she wanted to show that artists can present dissident works, that they can criticize the economic or the political system in Turkey. And even if some works might have seemed innocent, there was actually this perpetual intent to be critical. And by creating, let's say, these consistent group shows, she wanted to create a space where artists could courageously present their ideas, you know, like the total presentation of their ideas. And in a way, she was also supporting her own political views through the exhibitions. They were also a way of communicating what she was thinking. And the curatorial texts that were attached to the exhibitions were sometimes poetic, but actually they were very critical. And she was always tracing this colonial representation of Turkey within the European realm at that moment. And also, if you have the interest, it's good to maybe consult her website, because most of her writings and her doings are archived there. And at this moment, she opened her archive for researchers. And I was talking to her, and she mentioned that there are many opportunities to go as a resident artist or curator to Istanbul and research archives, also hers, which is public at the moment. And now I will move, let's say, to the last part of my presentation, to an exhibition, or let's say a biennial, which I really liked, and it was really special. It took place in 2019 in Taichung, which is a really large city in central Taiwan. It's called the Asian Art Biennial, and it takes place every 2 years in the Museum of Fine Arts in Taichung. And why I like this biennial in particular is because it was curated by 2 artists that I also mentioned before, Chao Weizhu, the artist that created the video with the stones and elephants, and Ho Tsun-yen, the artist who created the work about the Kyoto Philosophy School. And they are actually good friends and collaborators. And for the Asian Art Biennial in 2019, they proposed a really intriguing concept that can be read through the title, The Strangers from Beyond the Mountain and the Sea. And they constructed this exhibition in the Museum of Fine Arts on this trinomial stance, which is the strangers, the mountain, and the sea. And they explained their choice of terms, because this was very important. Everything started from the title. And the title really informs the exhibition. So the notion of the stranger was inspired by marebito, which is an ancient Japanese word describing beings that come from afar with the gifts of wisdom. And the stranger can take many forms, that of the migrant, of the ethnic minority, the colonist, the foreign merchant, the smuggler, the partisan, the shaman, the traitor. And these are all, let's say, conduits to the unknown outside. And they are reflections of our own selves. Because like the stranger is the one that makes us test limitation and raise questions. And the reason why, let's say, I also wanted to talk about it is because of this theory of displacement. I myself, I'm a displaced individual living from Romania and going to a completely different context, that is that of South Korea. But going deeper, let's say, it's interesting that to understand what the mountain represents and what the sea represents from the title, because the mountain refers to Zomia and the sea refers to the Zulu Sea. Zomia represents a vast highland area that cuts across Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Burma, China, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And the high altitude and rough terrain of Zomia, as described by the American anthropologist James C. Scott, forms a natural barrier against the control of the nation states that surround it, thus serving as a shelter for a variety of non-states people, such as ethnic minorities, guerrillas, or forgotten wars and drug empires. And Zomia has also been the site of a dialectical relationship between lowland empires that were founded upon sedentary agriculture and the highland tribes that were practicing a transitory form of agriculture. On the other side, the Zulu Sea is this marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean, between the Pacific Ocean and the South China Sea, that is bordered in the south by Borneo and in the north by the archipelagos of the Philippines. And historically, rich in maritime commerce, the Zulu Sea is also rife with slave raiding and piracy, and today is the stage for the activities of terrorist groups such as the Philippines-based jihadist militants of Abu Sayyaf. And within the exhibition strata, Zomia and Zulu, they function as tropes for the section of geography and politics, altitudes and anarchism. Hotzunyan believed that the understanding of the dynamics between the Zomia and the Zulu Sea requires a mode of history without borders. And I really like this concept because within this history of without borders, the flow of commodities, both legal and illegal, implicates the system of world commerce. And to support his affirmation, he quotes James Francis Warren, who stated that the Zulu Sea should be reframed as the Zulu Zone, which is an inherently unstable, generally dynamic, special system, which is not enduring, self-maintained, or autonomous. In the catalog of the Biennale, the two artist curators, they published a very interesting scheme, let's say a diamond-shaped scheme, that served as a reflection bedrock for their endeavor. Apart from the four, let's say, mentioned concepts, the like Zomia and the Zulu Sea and the one of the strangers, there are two other notions that are being used in this scheme, and that are the clouds and the minerals. And these terms involve a two-directional way of looking, because it's up and down. And it attracts the attention, let's say, from the curatorial point of view on the ecological disaster that we are now facing. And the cumulus of concepts and the information deriving from them was meant to address actually an essential question for both Chao Wei-shu and Hotzunyan. And that was how the unfinished project of decolonization intersects with the geographical and geological tangents. And for this, it's very nice because they introduced this symptom of the unfinished project of decolonization. And in order to, let's say, illustrate some of the theoretical threads that I mentioned, I will show you some works that I consider that are very interesting. And one of them is the work of the Chinese artist Liu Chuang, called Bitcoin Mining and Field Recording of Ethnic Minorities, produced in 2019. And at first glance, the film shows concentrated areas of Bitcoin mines in China that were filmed by using drones as part of what it looks as a field study, because the artist really went high into the mountains to film these amazing structures in which data is being circulated. And the gestures in the film that they are direct references to famous scenes from science fiction movies like Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Tarkovsky's Solaris. And why did the artist go to these films is because he considers that the aliens from the films were actually drawn from the anthropological documentation of various ethnic minorities in Zomia region. And in a dialogue with the other, that is the alien, the artist demonstrates that the energy gathered at the geological surface is actually the material memory of the earth. And the abstraction of the virtual currency is seen actually as an attempt to escape the reach of the modern nation state. Another work was the one of Gilad Ratman called The Workshop, that was actually produced in 2013 for the Israeli pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And the work consists of this amazing multi-channel audio-video installation that consists of a fictional documentation of a group of people that live from Israel, and they travel underground to finally reach the pavilion, the Israeli pavilion in Venice. And once they arrive in the pavilion, all these people that look really eccentric, but also art-oriented people, they start to sculpt their self-portraits in clay, and also to produce experimental sounds through the microphones that were inserted into the clay sculptures. And the sound were later transformed by a sound engineer in acoustic arrangement that were actually colonizing the entire space, making it very noisy and hard to stand. And in the context of the biennial, this work informed about the capabilities of the humans to redefine their own boundaries while escaping old structures in an attempt to recycle their own identity. And the surround sound in the space was emphasizing that there were ways to surpass limitation if one agrees to remake her own identity. Another interesting part that I wanted to mention here, let's say at the end of, let's say, uncanny curatorial use of footnotes, because in this exhibition, footnotes were spatial constructions that were inserted into 3 areas of the exhibition, and they were actually commenting on the exhibition, because the way that the space was used for the biennial was quite important. The 2 artist curators, they decided to remove all the partition walls in the museum and to reveal the crude space of the building. And for them, this was actually more freedom for the curatorial approach. And this also allowed a more, let's say, direct dialogue between the 30 sets of works that were presented in the biennial. And based on the fact that they used the space completely, and they also introduced these footnotes that, as I mentioned, they were in 3 parts of the exhibition. They fundamented the biennial in itself in 4 distinct chapters. The first and the second chapter, that was congruent with areas of the museum, presented the convergence of human history with mountains, sea, clouds, and animals, as informed by the diamond-shaped scheme. Then the third zone reflected on the mutation and transformation of humans and objects, while the 4th zone was centered on humans that transgressed their identity. And in these interstitial spaces of the museum, the visitors were exposed to the footnotes that presented a different type of history. And the visitors were able to see real maps of the discussed geographical areas from the exhibition, photos of some events that were discussed through the works of the exhibitions, diagrams, and everything was happened instantly, because the connection between the historical events that were disparate in the exhibition were instant in the footnotes. And practically all these elements gathered were coordinates of war and colonization, connecting such elements as the imperial view of Asia, the inter-regional strife, trade, and politics, as it was mentioned by the researcher Lini Xu in her catalog text. And and Chao Weizhu also added that in this way, the audience could read space, and the audience could understand how important space is when we perceive art and an artistic discourse. And I will just show you how the footnotes were being presented. And for, let's say, the finale, I would stop to the works of the Korean artist Liu Fan from the Relatum series that he developed from 1969 to 2019, because they represent a very good metaphor of space in the, let's say, genuine curatorial sense, because in this series, so he was presenting a stone that was breaking a pane of glass. So this like heavy rock was breaking it, and there was this again a trinomic relation between the stone, the pane, and the way that the breaking would look. And the artist was meditating, how the crack is being generated, because the same as in the curatorial profession, if you try too hard or the piercing is too hard, then it means that the artist or the curator, right, they didn't control the matter enough, because it's too much. It goes over the sublime in a way. But if the breakage then is too controlled, the same as in the curatorial work, because we can never control everything, then the result is dull. It's not interesting at all. On the other side, if the crack is too weak, then it looks like an accident, when people just don't observe it. And therefore the artist, as well like the curator, has to create a perfect tension in this relationship between her and the stone, which can be the concept, and the glass that can be the space. And all these elements, they all have to maintain their original state without any alteration in order to make the demonstration valid. And as Liu Fan says, when the fissure resulting from the big rock that is piercing the pane of glass, and from this cross permeation of the three elements, only in that moment, when this tension is resolved, then the glass is the one that becomes the object of art. Yes, and I think I should finish here. And if there is any interest to let's say, continue the discussion, it would be very nice.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anca, for this very, very thorough presentation. So maybe I could start with the first question. I find that this investigation on the curatorial time very, very intriguing, and just maybe just to add an extra explanation, I got the 3 out of 4. In the example of Flores, the time is bringing historical to the contemporary through the time of the art history, and then in Kim's example, tradition through the lens of Asian modernity, and at the Taiwan example, the human history as informed by the geopolitics beyond borders. I didn't get how the Turkish example problematizes this notion of curatorial time.
Because it was the way I also mentioned it. It was like this dialectics, right? That it started with how the curatorial profession was being formed, because in regard to the Turkish, to Beral Madra, there was this, like really historical content. Everything was formed based also on the political and economical time, because it depended on how Turkey was evolving in a way. And this is what I found it interesting, because in the curatorial discourse, there was always this dependency on the country and on the formation of the country in a way, the modernization of the country, bringing it to the contemporaneity. So I found that there it was this dialectical time, this like really thorough, formation of ideas that was, not cyclical, or it was just simply dialectic, going hand in hand with the context.
I understand, but do you think that the Turkish example is exceptional in this way?
In a way, why I wanted to mention the work of Beral Madra is because she was there from the beginning. That was for me exceptional. That she, in a way, controlled the beginning, if I was to say like this. She was, let's say, in the first Istanbul biennial, then she was part of this representation in Venice, because I did work with this idea of the representation, and followed, in a way, micro stories in big context, trying to see how they interrelate in a way.
Yeah. Excellent.
So this was for me the exception, let's say, what was exceptional, the beginning, that, we were talking to somebody that was there at the beginning and had the sense of how the 70s really looked like, how the 80s really looked like, and reflected onto the art events. This was interesting for me. Of course, the discussions that I had with them were really broad, and I couldn't bring forward everything that we discussed, and the way that, unfortunately, the time never allows you. But I tried to make a synthesis of what we talked.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I don't want to usurp your time. If anybody has a question to intervene, I will be glad to. Does anybody have a question? Because if not, yeah. Does anyone know? Yeah, if not, I would just, I found this Korean examples super fascinating. This meditation on the positive aspects of tradition with regard to Asian modernism, and also kind of wanted maybe to touch upon our particular context in this kind of denigration of tradition as a pure patriarchal and archaic concept, pre-modern even, always pulling us down. So maybe since you are from our neck of the woods, can you maybe kind of draw some similarities and or some apparent differences between how tradition relates to the context of Asian modernity, and how it kind of relates to our experience of modernity in maybe Eastern or Southeastern Europe?
But here, like, I have to state from the beginning that actually in regard to tradition, there aren't any similarities between our areas. It's like totally different philosophical system in regard to everything. So it's hard to draw any line in this regard. What I would say about tradition, because while I was talking to Hyunjin Kim, I realized that in our area, we lost the momentum to discuss tradition, because there always has to be a momentum. There has to be a context. And in her case, it was really beneficial to be in a group of creators that started to experience tradition on their own bodies. So I think that this was very interesting, because they discussed tradition from this bodily experience, from this corporeal awareness. And in this way, tradition didn't look nationalistic, didn't look too old or too unfancy. But it's hard to draw a line, because we are talking about two
very different things. Yeah, I understand.
Two different things. It's almost impossible.
I understand, but what do you mean? But by us losing momentum or not having momentum to kind of have the same discussion?
Yes, because I think that talking about tradition, has to go hand in hand with let's say, political context or a bigger issue that is being, discussed. It has to be linked to something in order not to become nationalistic in a way. So in regard to our area, I think that it would have been interesting to rediscuss traditions after the fall of communism. That could have been a good moment to do it, because then it was like a big umbrella, and we could have extracted and also talk about these issues from another perspective. But I think that now, as we are experiencing this post-capitalism, it's very hard to do it without being totally anachronical or antagonistic with the moment. It's very hard. And yes, I think in a way we are also strangling our own histories, but maybe this can also be beneficial. Maybe this can also stem into another policy of place, of thought, of time.
Yeah, this is exactly how it feels. The tradition is somehow completely lost on us. This is why I found this Korean example very, very exhilarating. I can't imagine something like this being possible in this context. Yeah.
Yes, but also how it was possible, and this was also, let's say, a secret of this interpretation, was that Hyunjin Kim and Siren and Yong Chung, they looked into the biographies of the different creators. So they look into the micro histories, and this enabled them to find intricate things, like analyzing photographs, seeing details. So this can also be a way of handling a missing moment. When you look at something that is so obvious, but actually you never saw those details, and looking with different eyes, maybe this is what we need to do, I guess.
Okay. Would anybody like to intervene with the question? No one? Okay, maybe just another question from me. That I was just a thought has occurred to me while I was listening to your examples, especially the ones including this hybrid positions of artists as curators. I was wondering if you saw this year's documenta, and maybe would you draw some comparisons with for example, the last of your examples and this year's documenta?
So unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to reach it because I just arrived to Romania. So I mean, I'm really sad that I couldn't reach it. Apart from the, let's say, controversies around it, I think that from what I've read and what I've heard from friends that visited, everybody was, let's say, exhilarated by the new artistic positions. They were seeing artists that they've never heard before, and they were acquainted to histories and to thematics that were totally unknown to them.
Exactly.
And I think that this is something that artist curators do, because they can link differently to a context, maybe from a totally, let's say, from a totally non-traditional way. But in a way, what I reflected in regard to this year's documenta was, I actually went back in time to the one in 1955, the first edition, created by Bode, because in that moment, he really wanted to destroy the traditional way of making art exhibitions. This was what his purpose, that's how it was ignited, this idea of the documenta, going against any type of tradition, any type of dominant discourse. And using, and what was interesting, it was so correctly done because they used all the spatial theories of the moment, right? Using the way that the Bauhaus would arrange their spaces to create a display. So that was back then. So it was this artistic manner of treating space that made it look different. And also what was nice, I remember from my readings about Documenta in 1955, was that they tried to bring works to this human scale. All the works that usually were higher, at that Documenta they went lower, so that the public would be closer to them. So this is also something I consider stems from an artistic perspective.
Exactly.
Because you think different of the audience.
Exactly, and also the thing you were touching upon, the speciality and the mode of display. I think that they were completely transgressed a lot of this mannerism of showing contemporary art. It's kind of making the whole exhibition function as a kind of how would I say, a fair of ideas rather than a place of exposition, you know.
Yes, a representation merely. Yes.
Hello, I have a question, if I may.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, firstly, for a very interesting presentation. It was really very interesting things. I wanted to ask, because in the beginning you mentioned that there were some zones of comfort and discomfort also in these cases that you will present. So I wonder about the discomfort, because I couldn't see or trace any discomfort in these cases. So maybe if you can say something about that. Thank you.
Yes, let me check a bit my notes. When I was mentioning about about the discomfort, was like on one side I was also thinking about the examples from Turkey, where due to the, let's say, the pressure, the socio-political pressure, things couldn't coalesce, but then somehow there was a way through, sublimating, let's say, this surface tension. On the other side, also, maybe here I didn't go into detail in regard to the discussion with Patrick Flores, because we were talking about form and the formalist approach to curating that can actually be discomfortable, can be uncomfortable, because in the moment that you create, let's say, a formalist approach, then you have to create a different space around each work. And I was making this parallel between form and the formation of identity. And this was the area of discomfort that I was trying to balance there. How like form in itself, also the curatorial form, can mantle and dismantle the identity. And that for me was an area of discomfort in the creation of identity. And also in the case of Hyunjin, maybe that's where it's more obvious. It was this relation to tradition, the way that at first, tradition was being rejected, and it did create discomfort to talk about this patriarchal form of tradition. But then again, you embrace what creates discomfort in order to discuss it and to, let's say, as I try to make this conjunct between tradition and her specific curatorial time. So in a way, for me, the space of discomfort was always retransformed, because I was trying to show how pressure, again, like the formalist pressure of identity, can actually open something, and in a way that we don't have to resist the pressure that creates discomfort, because the most interesting things appear through in that context. So it was this transformation. Maybe I should have nuanced it more and discuss, yes, like from this perspective, that the space of discomfort is actually being transformed in a space that can be comfortable.
Great, thank you so much.
Hey, it's not so good light. I have hello Anca, hello everybody.
Hello,
Thank you for bringing us in a dialogue with your 4 examples. I would like to go back to lost momentum in dealing with tradition in case of Eastern European art context. Actually, I was thinking how I observe now what is happening, for example, in Ukraine, and also, the connection between the decolonial project and within the post-communist or post-socialist context. You mentioned the danger of falling into the nationalistic trap. How you would see the possibility in Eastern Europe and post-communist context to, in connection to the decolonial project, turn or to deal with tradition without falling in the trap of nationalism?
That would be like, let's say, a major project for sure. But it can be interesting. I think that, as I mentioned, the method of the seminar, I think that if there would be this context of discussions in which researchers would, like, this is like really practical, I'm talking from a really practical perspective, if researchers would really meet and discuss about the issues that really, like, that actually are really typical for our area, I think this could really create a new strata, like within the European context. Because what I feel is that in our area, there are really many similarities, and we really went through a lot of like historical threads together. And if there could be, let's say, a community of good practice could be created in the area that could discuss all these processes and in a way resist the process of colonization and openly discuss decolonization and what this means. What does it mean? Like, because, when I first thought about the presentation, it was April, and it was at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. And in that moment, I had really a lot of arguments in regard to what postcolonialism means, and how sometimes the Western view shapes our perspective. And actually, for instance, like us in Central Eastern Europe, we do have a different perspective. Like, you know, it's different, sometimes a different way of using language, and there are some threads and they are really strong. But after the conflict in Ukraine and after everything that happened, I started to question this. Actually, I started to not disregard the Westernization that much. I don't know. I don't know why, because of course this is a question for myself. And when Vladimir asked if I want to maintain the same abstract of the presentation, I actually thought many times, because in a way I was questioning the subject matter that I proposed in April. I didn't find that it was really an actuality. And today I really wanted, as I mentioned at the beginning, to nuance my presentation with the Cuban case, what was happening in Cuba in 2015, because at that moment, during that Biennale, there was a consortium of thinkers, curators and artists and theorists that discussed the process of decolonization in regard to the Caribbean and to the Americas. And what they did was exactly what I was mentioning, like they met for a few days and they stayed together in different contexts in the city, and they started to discuss openly about these issues, putting together things that united them or things that were actually not that comfortable in a way. And after those discussions, you know, many things stemmed, like there was a lot of energy and there were a lot of questions that were answered. So I think that this is what's important. I think that singular positions are not that relevant anymore. That's why I mentioned the curatorial self-effacement, because I consider that in the next time, the next level, it's more important to create like more unity in a way, more unity, to give regard to a more articulated view that doesn't come from a single individual, but comes from a group of individuals that are from the same context in a way. So this contextualization should be really used. It shouldn't only be theoretical. You know, for me, how I want to replace in a way the postcolonial is with the contextual. This is my interest now in a way. So this would be, let's say, the one word answer to your question would be context, contextualization, and the real one, for instance, the real one that would also stem from this idea of the cultural, because I mentioned cultural many times, as I wanted to move away from contemporary art or only art. You know, I'm more interested in cultural and in creating communities of culture rather than artistic or curatorial, or so these two words then, cultural and context, double C.
Thank you so much.
Any last questions, maybe? Then I would like to thank you all for joining, and especially Anca for this abundance of information and connections. So thank you for this lecture. And
yes, thank you for the opportunity. I really had a good time and I'm happy that I could talk to you. Really happy.